Hey guys, Nirvana here. Welcome to a very long lecture video where I talk at you with some slides in the background. Nah, I'm just kidding, there's a bit more to this video. So, you've been tinkering away in the editor and you're trying to create something as gorgeous, as jaw-dropping, as painstakingly crafted as WoW.wad. But you keep coming up short. What can we do to fix this? There are a lot of factors that go into making a good looking Doom map, and like all artistic endeavours, the results will always be viewed through a subjective lens anyway. You're also not going to be skill sword day one. So with this in mind, one of the most important things you can learn is that it's okay to make something that looks good to you, even if it might upset the sensibilities of other people. With that being said, let's think about some of the more general ways you can make things look nice in the Doom engine. Note that most of what I'll be talking about will relate to limit removing ports, and the focus is going to be on boom and boom adjacent styling, as that's what I generally make myself. Most of this will be applicable to other formats anyway, so if you make UDMF maps, then you're still going to be able to use a lot of this in your own maps. The core element of any Doom map's aesthetics is its architecture. You can't have a map without walls and floors and everything in between. Making aesthetically pleasing architecture in Doom often comes down to some key elements. Firstly, you'll want to come up with some kind of theme for the map. Do you want it to be set in hell? Is the map on a boat? Are we wherever this is? Whatever the theme and however abstract you intend to be, there's always room to create a sense of place in your map. Take Magnolia Map 1 as an example. There is no sense that this is a place that exists in the real world. No attempt is being made at realism, but you can still feel your presence in an explorable, tangible environment. Sometimes it's enough to create something that is entirely alien or just another place entirely. Now, a lot of this otherworldly aesthetic works well because the structures Rubik's has created in this open void world you're inhabiting give a sense that there is something more outside of just the gameplay space going on. Extra little structures outside of your main gameplay arena can help to do this, and it's a tool Rubik's employs a lot to expand his maps beyond Doomgo's encounters. In a similar vein, Bemuse will often create an entire map and then turn it into a building, surrounded by a large outside space, with windows that can connect the lines of sight from different parts of the map to each other. This helps to make Bemuse maps feel like they have a setting, that they aren't just a set of interconnected rooms, but rather a structure that you're fighting your way through. In terms of actually constructing architecture, you don't always have to go down the highly detailed route of a map like Miasma. Oftentimes it can be just as effective to be sparing in terms of detail in order to let the engine's lighting and contrast do the work for you. Many think of Rubik's as one of the strongest mappers in terms of visuals, myself included, and a key factor of his work is that his line use is very considered. There are times where he uses a lot of detailing, but he often uses restrained techniques so he can get more mileage out of his lighting. An important thing to note is that line count has nothing to do with how visually pleasing a map is. Insane Gazebo's Sunder maps aren't incredible to look at just because there are a lot of lines used. They're incredible because the lines are put down with creative purpose. They are used specifically to facilitate the conceptual needs of the size and scope of the areas Gazebo is constructing. You can make fantastic looking maps with very few lines as well, by simply using effective lighting and contrast and having your architecture built around striking features. Benjigami is one of my favorite mappers for this reason. He uses very few lines in many of his maps, but has very focused creative concepts, with memorable focal points such as the strobing lights of Toilet of the Gods Map 3, or the high contrast texture work of the Egg of Human Endeavors. Remember that architecture doesn't just have to be stagnant walls and ceiling detail as well. Having moving parts and decorations like torches and tech pillars can make a huge difference to the visuals of a map. The aesthetics of slow lowering bars or of corpses on the ground, crushes coming from the ceiling, the aesthetics of emptiness in a space, or of fullness. All of these things can be storytelling elements, and they all add a certain look and feel to spaces. Always think about how the player will react to a space. Look at it from multiple angles to see how it looks from a certain doorway or window, and try to picture how the player will move through an area and what will catch their eye. This is as important for gameplay and progression as it is for overall looks, because leading the player through spaces via brightened switches or specifically placed monsters is an important aspect of level design. To give a concrete example of how these aesthetic elements can intermingle with gameplay, let's take a quick look at Abandoned Map 4. This map is by Benjigami, and it has my favorite use of this kind of aesthetic element of any map that I've played. So let's take a look at the setup. As you enter this arena, you can hear the sound of a slowly lowering and raising lift. It's a noise that interplays with the map's MIDI and adds a rhythmic beat that creates tension in the space. Benja sets up an encounter here with some tight platforms you have to traverse, and a roaming cyber demon later on that will often block your routes and force you to move around a lot more. Now, we could have introduced more monsters into this encounter by using a teleporter, but instead, the monsters are slowly dragged up the lift, like products on a factory line, which brings the monsters organically into the arena. This lift does so many things in the space. It adds tension through the rhythmic sound it produces, as well as the player assuming it must exist for some nefarious reason since they're playing a Benjigami map in Abandoned. Extra sound it creates also intermingles with the MIDI and makes the map feel more alive. It adds to the overall tech aesthetic of the map. It directly impacts gameplay by bringing monsters into the arena. It introduces monsters organically, making the space feel more grounded and real. It also functions as progression to the next part of the map later on. That's 6 separate functions performed by one lift. Now, the point here isn't to make you feel like you have to make a lift serve 6 different functions, or to make you reinvent the wheel every time you make an encounter or architecture, but the point is that introducing elements that make a room or arena feel like they exist for reasons other than just the player to move around in can really add to the atmosphere and immersion people experience playing your map. Whether you're building a detailed tech base or a sparse, abstract void space, remember that the engine is blocky by design. You'll be working line to line, vertex to vertex, with even hitboxes being squares. So be aware that even circular surfaces will often have that blockiness added to them. Limitations of the engine in terms of being able to create realistic spaces often mean that abstract designs will pay off. Realism and Doomcute are always fun tools to employ in a Doom mod, and you can get some great mileage out of them, but it can be painstaking work, and if the effort isn't put in to really drive home the aesthetic, it can look a bit awkward and out of place. Now, Lost Civilization is an example of realism done right in Doom. There's enough detail that you get a sense that this is a real, lived-in environment, but there's also an attention to the engine's quirks, with line depths kept to a minimum, and the Doomcute elements having a lot of focus. Key is consistency. Lost Civ continuously delivers on producing realistic spaces and minute details, which makes the couches, fireplaces, and stovetops feel like they belong in the maps. If the rest of the map takes place in an abstract environment, then these kinds of details could look incredibly out of place. Natural environments are a particular challenge to make in Doom due to the engine being better at squares and cubes. Some things you can do to help make outdoor spaces more convincing are layering various textures to help convey the kind of variety you find in natural structures, using mid-textures like vines and grass to add to the kind of visual clutter of an organic space, and using fixed light sources to help separate the outdoor and indoor areas of a map. In terms of making maps that will generally look decent in Doom, abstract architecture can produce fantastic results at a much cheaper line depth cost than attempting to go for realism. Green Mine, for instance, a map I created for Haste, only took roughly 2 to 3 sessions of a few hours to make, and the line count is significantly lower than a lot of my other maps. However, I'd still put this map up there as one of my favorite things that I've created because it hits all the key notes that I wanted to aesthetically. My main focus when making the map was on contrast, both with bright textures against the black backdrop and with high contrast light and shadow work. I also had inspiration for the map to begin with, which can help using the deep blues, greens, and wood tones that make RD's Eden such a nice looking wood, and combining them with the drowned aesthetic of Shrine of Amana from Dark Souls 2. Much of the time, having just a few key aesthetic notes you want to hit can give you enough to work with to create a map, without needing to be bogged down in all the details immediately. Binding element for all of this was the MIDI. Selecting the right MIDI for your WOD is incredibly important, and whether it comes at the end of your process to bring all of these elements together, or at the beginning to inform the experience, it's definitely something you should think about when mapping. Or you end up with D running and that's just going to be jail for you.
You're playing music too loud, right to jail, right away.
Vanilla Doom's textures are iconic, and you can get a huge amount of mileage out of them when creating maps. Seriously, if you think Vanilla Doom 2 textures aren't worth using, check out Counterattack by Mechadon, and then come back to me with your tail between your legs. You idiot.
Pure vanilla.
Now, custom textures in Doom will add a lot to your WOD, and can help give it a distinct feel. Having said that, if you're using a gigantic texture pack, it can help to come up with a texture theme for your map, or the overall WOD in order to create cohesion between levels. Basically, just because you have 1,000 textures in your resource pack doesn't mean you have to use 1,000 textures in your maps. Coming up with a texture theme, you can go with some obvious approaches that will generally look good. Having a base color like a grey, brown or black with a strong accent color has become a staple of Doom mapping for a while, especially with Slaughter design, and contrast like this is always a great way to quickly make a map in Doom look halfway decent. I personally tend to aim for 2 separate accent colors that I can interplay, which allows me to work in several different themes into a map. As a side note, using recolors of vanilla Doom textures is a great way to keep your WOD grounded in Doom, and you should be careful about what games you rip textures from to use in your maps. While Ultra HD 4K textures look great in an Unreal Engine game, having them as the backdrop to a collection of sprites can look, shall we say,
Terrible. That's a terrible idea.
At the end of the day, the texture theme you choose can be whatever you want, and if a complete lack of cohesion is what you're after, then I say go for it. I'm really just trying to get you thinking about your intentions behind your design decisions here. And enough with the fire blue maps, okay? We get it, it's the meme texture, guys, come on. A lot of people will tell you to stick to one texture theme for the whole map and don't deviate from it, but I'd suggest that as long as you maintain some cohesive elements, such as a consistent use of color, specific texturing, or even a specific piece of architecture like pillars or lighting effects, you can usually get away with moving the player through a variety of different themes. I'd personally even encourage it, as I think the visual shifts make maps much more interesting. You can apply all of this across a longer WOD too. For instance, if you do have maps that have wildly different themes in your WOD, you might consider having some textures or motifs that span multiple maps in order to create a more cohesive WOD. As with everything I say in this video though, intentionality is key. If you intend for your WOD to lack cohesion thematically, that's totally cool too, but some thought behind it can help to indicate to the player that it isn't just laziness. You can also iterate on a theme. A WOD like Ancient Aliens might use the same overall palette throughout, but it shifts locations and texture themes to keep things interesting. Many of Skillsource WODs keep an overarching theme, but iterate on it over the course of the WOD to help build a narrative through level design, and to keep the environments fresh. A custom palette can really make or break a WOD. Many of Rubik's WODs are known specifically for their palettes. The magenta highlights of Stardate 20XD6, the high contrast deep purples of 20XD7, the deep blues of Swim with the Whales. An important aspect of the way to handle a palette is making sure that it isn't an afterthought, or at least making it seem that way. The palette in Fracture Worlds was one of the first things I worked on for the WOD, and it informed a huge amount of the design, from the texture themes to the architecture, and even some of the combat design. Always remember when making a custom palette to not be lazy. If you change the greens, you'll need to change a lot of small pixels on metal textures, weapons, and monsters in order for them not to look off. And if you change the red range, well...
big mistake.
In most modern games, lighting is designed to emulate the real world. It's used to accent certain things, create certain points of interest for players, and make a space feel realistic. In Doom, however, while lighting can be used in all of those ways, it can often be much more effective to use it as simply another artistic element. Gradient lighting is a technique often employed by mappers to not only create lighting that transitions into darkness, but also as a way to create visual effects that have nothing to do with lighting, and everything to do with looking real good.
How you looking? So good, okay. I mean, so good.
Another great use of lighting in Doom is lighting sequences. Now, lighting sequences can bring a lot of life to a space in Doom. Most aesthetic elements in Doom mods are static, with fixed architecture and minimal moving parts aside from monsters and the occasional lift. Lighting sequences help to add motion to a space, and to help it feel like there are things going on when the player isn't around. They seem complex at first, but they're fairly simple Voodoo setups in Boom format maps, and UDMF can handle them with a few lines of ACS or some specific actions. So what are you waiting for? Get out there and create some fancy lighting. Or else. Not really, this is just for fun. Unless... Music is an important part of any game, and it's a fundamental aspect of creating atmosphere in Doom maps. Many mappers will start out with a MIDI as a source of inspiration for their maps. Certain mappers will find the MIDI first and listen to it while they map, while I tend to like to have spaces and some form of theme for the map first and find a MIDI that complements it. Whenever you decide to get a MIDI involved in the process, it's something you should think about as an important aspect of your map. There are a few things to think about when searching for Doom music. The first thing is to consider your format. The MIDI format is generally what people use for Doom, because the original game uses it, and it tends to blend into the sounds of the game well, which can help avoid the track from sounding like it's simply coming from a playlist in the background while you play the game. This doesn't mean that you can't use other file formats. NoSB 2 and 3 use tracker files for their music, and it helps to give the WOD a unique identity. There are even times when MP3s can work well in UDMF WODs, though I'd argue that MP3 and similar formats have a high chance of feeling out of place alongside Doom, so keep that in mind. If you are going to use these formats, make sure that they're not over compressed or low quality, so that the music at least sounds good. The second major thing is to make sure that the MIDI you're using loops correctly. A jarring ending to a MIDI before it restarts will take the player out of the game, and it'll make the experience of listening to the track repeatedly less enjoyable. Making sure that the MIDI matches the pacing in the map is important too. If you think about map 29 of Sunlust, it's a short map with incredibly hard combat and a balls to the wall opening. Therefore, its MIDI reflects that. If you took this same MIDI and put it onto one of the lengthy maps at Abandon though, you get sick of it pretty fast. Try to match the tempo of your MIDI to the tempo of your map. Also, make sure that your MIDI is long enough for your map. When I made Entropy, I used a Rubik's MIDI that I plucked from his site, which, upon hearing, he noted was a little short for the incredibly long WOD I'd put together. He extended the MIDI for me, adding some filler sections to help the pacing of the MIDI as well. Just remember that if your map is long, and if it's challenging, the player will have to spend a lot of time with the MIDI, meaning a short loop will get old very fast. MIDIs with high-pitched sounds, lots of noise, and other annoying things about them will also grate pretty quickly in these scenarios. So think about that when you select your track. Or just be time of death. You've built your WOD, spent countless hours on the details and the architecture, finding the perfect MIDI and creating memorable encounters, and then you leave the map names as default on the auto map and intermission screen. You got a default HUD, and players end up in underhalls afterwards with the atmosphere of whatever they just played entirely dispersed. Changing things like the auto map text and HUD elements can really help to complete the package you've worked so hard on. Small details like different key sprites, custom monsters that match your palette better, and intermission music that helps to bind the levels together can really help to add an extra level of polish to a WOD. I mean, why spend 6 months on a project making detailed maps and then leave a bunch of the finishing touches default? It's jarring for the player to see the wrong map names for your maps, and it's going to take them out of the experience, so it's definitely worth thinking about. Naming your WOD also comes into this. Just remember that your WOD will forever be known by that title, and while you're absolutely loving the name pppoopoo.wod right now, you might want to think about it a bit longer before putting it out there. It's a bad name. So these have just been some basic guidelines and ideas for making a good looking WOD in Doom. All of these thoughts come with my own personal biases, and your project might be something completely outside of those parameters, and that's totally fine. The important thing is to seek out what you enjoy and try to grow your own personal style. I also want to end by saying that you shouldn't be afraid to be earnest in what you create. I personally find mapping to be a great creative outlet, and I put a lot of myself into my WODs, and I always enjoy playing WODs that are made with this same ethos. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope these ramblings were useful in some way. Also guys, use software, it's better than OpenGL, okay?